Welcome to The Explainer. What if I told you there's a single theory that could explain every major decision of Donald Trump's presidency? Well, today we're unpacking a pretty fascinating and definitely controversial idea from our source material that claims to do just that. So, right off the bat, our source material throws this really interesting puzzle at us. How can one president authorize lethal force in places like Iran and Venezuela, but at the same time be seen by others as a peacemaker? It feels like a contradiction, right? Well, the theory we're looking at today suggests the answer is all about understanding who the real target of those actions was. Okay, so to really get our heads around this theory, we first have to look at what the source calls Trump's countercultural doctrine. His actions were often described as unconventional, and that led to a lot of confusion. Some people called him a neocon, others swore he was an isolationist. But according to the theory we're digging into, both of those labels totally miss the point. Why? Because they assume he's aiming at the usual targets. And this theory says he wasn't. All right, so if his target wasn't a specific country, then what or who was it? The theory proposes that the real adversary isn't a nation you can find on a map at all, but something much, much bigger and more hidden. Think about it. We're so used to thinking of enemies as nations, right? It's always Russia or China or some other country. But this theory asks us to consider a totally different idea. What if Trump was aiming at a different kind of power structure entirely? And here it is. This is the absolute core of the whole theory. The true adversary, according to the source, is what it calls the modern-day British Empire. Now, to be super clear, it's not talking about the United Kingdom. It's a term for a global network, a web of non-state actors, international banks, and political influencers. Basically, it's a specific and kind of sinister take on what a lot of people just call globalization. To make this easier to picture, the source uses this really vivid metaphor, an octopus. It says this thing has its tentacles in all sorts of operations, both illegal and quasi-legal. We're talking international banks, offshore tax havens, drug money laundering, even human trafficking networks, and also things like NGOs and foundations. The whole point, supposedly, is to weaken actual countries and consolidate power for a global elite. Okay, so that's the theory. But how does it actually play out in the real world, in actual foreign policy? Well, the source claims it's all about fighting something the British themselves historically called the Great Game. The source argues that in this great game, people and even entire countries are treated like they're just pawns on a global chessboard. And the ultimate goal, according to this theory? To keep nations fighting each other so that no single country can ever get powerful enough to challenge the empire's financial control over the whole system. Now, this slide is where it gets really interesting because it applies the theory to two very different conflicts. On the left, we've got the Venezuela operation. The source argues this wasn't about regime change at all. It was a targeted strike against the Octopus's money, its drug and financial networks. But then you look at the right side, the Ukraine war, and the source frames this as a classic great game move, using one nation to bleed another, in this case using Ukraine to weaken Russia, with supposedly little care for the Ukrainian people themselves. And to back this view up, the source points to some really specific moments. It alleges that figures like the UK's Boris Johnson, along with NATO, deliberately stepped in and killed peace deals back in 2022. The goal, it claims, was specifically to keep the war going, an action that directly serves the empire's strategic interests. But this fight isn't just about military action. The source claims a huge part of it is economic. It's about trying to reverse a system that's been designed to pull wealth out of nations. So, the source throws out this absolutely massive number, $18 trillion. It alleges this is how much investment President Trump brought back into the United States. But here's the crucial part. It says this money wasn't for the Treasury or for Wall Street. It was aimed directly at the real productive economy. Making stuff. And this slide lays out exactly how that four-step strategy was supposed to work. First, you get foreign money for specific U.S. projects. Then, and this is key, you channel that money directly into building things, like factories and warehouses, completely bypassing the Federal Reserve and the big financial markets. The end result? A boom in blue-collar jobs and a revitalized industrial base. So within this theory, that's the whole point. This economic strategy is a direct challenge. It's an end run, just like the quote says, around the very financial institutions that the theory claims have actually profited from decades of deindustrialization in the first place. Ultimately, when you pull all these threads together,
The source frames this whole situation not as just another political squabble, but as a deep, fundamental clash of worldviews.
This perspective argues that all the political drama we see every day, Democrats versus Republicans, is basically a distraction. It's just a shadow version of the real conflict. The true battle, it claims, is much bigger and much older, and it's all about how the world should be organized. And this slide puts those two competing systems, as the source defines them, side by side. On the left, you have the American system, which this theory says Trump is fighting for. Its focus on national sovereignty, industrial power, and a world of strong, independent nations. And on the right, you have the empire system. That's all about global governance, financial control, and transnational institutions that, according to this view, exist to weaken the nation-state.
And that's really the final, provocative thought this whole theory leaves us with. What if the political battles we see every day are just moves in a much larger, hidden game? A game for control not of a country, but of the entire global system. What if that's the true chessboard?